Hi there, for today's video, we are going to be going over characters and setting. We'll be talking about fantasy characters and fantasy setting, because in fantasy, the characters and setting may be a little bit different than in a realistic fiction, okay? Or in a nonfiction story, right? All right, so fantasy characters. The types of characters you might see in a fantasy are not found in real life. They sometimes do amazing things. Maybe they have magic. Maybe they have special powers. The animals talk and act like people. Okay, and sometimes creatures or things can come to life. For example, maybe this pen could come to life and start talking, right? That's not real. That's fantasy. Okay, and that's what I mean by not found in real life. Here are some characters from the story, The Day the Crowns Quit. They're holding little signs. This is fake. It cannot actually happen, okay? Fantasy. Now, fantasy setting, where and when the story takes place is unusual. So it might not be a real place. It might be in the clouds, right? It might be underwater. Here's the example of the Magic School Bus, and Miss Frizzle took her class on a field trip underwater. That's unusual. That cannot really happen, can it? No, you cannot take a school bus underwater. Plus, it's called the Magic School Bus. So the school bus can shrink, become a submarine. It can fly. It's not real. It's fake. Okay? So the setting is very unusual. All right. So what I have for our little activity together is characters and setting, but we're going to organize these pictures in the right square. So we have fantasy characters and fantasy setting. And then I have a couple of pictures that don't belong in either one. They're not fantasy. So my first one up is this character right here. This character is the giant from Jack and the Beanstalk. See? So as you can tell, he's a giant. He's tearing up the beanstalk. Give me a thumbs up if this is a fantasy character. Or a thumbs down for no, it's not. This is a fantasy character. We do not have giants like this in real life, do we? No. All right, now here is a gorilla. It's a photograph of a gorilla. Now, this is a photograph, meaning it's a real picture. Is this an example of a fantasy character or fantasy setting? No, it's not, is it? It's actual photograph, meaning it is real. So I'll put that right there. All right, let's grab another picture. Here is the rainbow fish from the story. Now, is this a real character? Is this a real fish? Or is this a fantasy character made up? Thumbs up for fantasy, thumbs down for nope. It's not fantasy, it's real. This is a fantasy character. Why? Because if you remember in that story, he's talking to other fish, right? And he's taking off his scales, his pretty scales, and giving them to other fish. That's not real. That's made up. It's fake. Okay, here is Chrysanthemum. We're actually going to read the story about her today. Is this a fantasy character or a real character? This is a fantasy character. As you can tell, this is Little Mouse, and she's dressed up and behaving like a person, like people, right? So that was one of the characteristics for fantasy characters, whenever the animals behave like people. And then my last example for a character is this one right here. This is Amelia Earhart. We've read 2 stories on her, 2 biographies. Now, is Amelia Earhart an example of fantasy character or a real person? Real, right? This is a photograph of her. So that's not an example of fantasy character. Now we're on fantasy setting. Remember, it's unusual. Most likely, here's our little example for setting. Takes place in another world or universe. Fantasyland, traveling through time. So this right here is actually the underwater castle in the story The Little Mermaid. Is that an example of fantasy, or is that real? I hope you have your thumbs up. This is an example of fantasy. This is not real. You're not going to have underwater castles like this. Even though they sound cool, not going to actually happen. All right, so here is picture of Nidec Elementary School, the school that you attend. Is this a fantasy setting or a real place? Fantasy or real? I hope you have your thumbs down because this is a real place. So we cannot put it here. We got to put this one over here with the real. Then here's another picture. This is the tower in the story Rapunzel, or the movie Tangled. Is this a real place? Thumbs down for real, thumbs up for fantasy. Fantasy or real? This is fantasy. This is not a real place. It's made up. It's in a different magical land, right? Made up land. All right, and then our last picture right here. Is a picture of H-E-B. Is H-E-B a real place? Thumbs down for real, thumbs up for fantasy. This is a real place, right? Okay, so I just wanted to show you some examples of what fantasy might be or look like, and what some examples of real places would look like, or real people, or real animals, all right? So I hope you like this little review of our characters and setting, and I hope you now understand the difference between fantasy characters and real characters, or real people. Fantasy setting and real places, okay?